An elegant woman enters the luxurious engagement party of her ex-husband, holding hands with two identical boys who have his same eyes. The hall freezes. The sound of her heels on the marble breaks the rehearsed perfection of the night. She stops in front of the bride, looks at the groom, and says, "These are the children he rejected before they were even born." One sentence, one shockwave, and the empire of lies begins to crumble. What she's about to reveal will destroy everything. Before we begin this touching story, comment below which city you're watching from and like the video to keep following along. The crisp autumn air of Oxford carried a peculiar stillness as Eleanor Bennet stood frozen in the doorway of the Georgian townhouse she had called home for the past 5 years. Her husband's words hung in the space between them like shards of glass. "Get out," Richard Harrington repeated, his voice deceptively calm, betrayed only by the white-knuckled grip on his mobile phone. "I want you gone within the hour." "Richard, please." Eleanor's voice trembled as she instinctively placed a protective hand over her belly, where their unborn child grew. "Whatever you think I have done, I don't think, Eleanor. I know." He thrust the phone screen towards her face, displaying a series of text messages she had allegedly sent to a man she barely knew. "Explain these, then. Explain how you've been carrying on with Peter from your pottery class for months behind my back." Eleanor's face paled as she scanned the messages. "These aren't mine. I never wrote these. Richard, you must believe me." The distinguished pharmaceutical executive who had charmed Oxford's elite circles with his philanthropy and business acumen now looked at his wife with cold disdain. At 42, Richard Harrington's commanding presence and prematurely silver temples had always drawn admiring glances. Today, however, his handsome features were contorted with contempt. "Julian forwarded them to me. He received them by mistake because you sent them to the wrong number. Did you forget he's been using his old mobile since his new one was stolen?" Richard's voice was laden with bitterness. "How convenient that you're suddenly carrying a child after 3 years of trying. Is it even mine?" From the corner of the room, Sophie Blackwood, Richard's new executive assistant, observed the scene with carefully disguised satisfaction. Her perfectly manicured fingers texted rapidly under the kitchen island. "It's working. He's throwing her out. Richard, I'm 14 weeks pregnant with your child. Our child." Eleanor's voice cracked as tears streamed down her face. "I've never been unfaithful. Someone is setting me up." "Pack what you need for tonight. I'll have your other things sent to wherever you end up," Richard replied, turning away from his wife's distress. "My solicitor will be in touch." Outside, rain began to fall, mirroring the tears that coursed down Eleanor's cheeks as she stumbled up the stairs to gather some belongings. Her hands shook as she placed items in a small suitcase: a photograph of her parents, some clothes, her prenatal vitamins. As Eleanor descended the stairs, she noticed Julian Whitfield, Richard's business partner and supposedly her friend, had arrived. He was standing too close to Sophie, their heads bent together in urgent conversation that ceased abruptly when they spotted her. "Eleanor," Julian acknowledged, with practiced concern. "Richard told me what happened. I'm truly sorry." The brig, false sympathy in his voice made her stomach turn. Eleanor looked from Julian to Sophie, then to Richard, a terrible clarity suddenly dawning. "This is a mistake, Richard," she said quietly. "Someday you'll realize that. And when you do, I hope it's not too late." With those words, Eleanor Bennet stepped out into the rain, her world shattered, unaware that she carried not one but 2 lives within her, or that her departure was precisely what Julian and Sophie had orchestrated to gain control of Harrington Pharmaceuticals and its revolutionary new drug formulation. As the black cab pulled away from the elegant home in Oxford's most prestigious neighborhood, Eleanor's hand again found her belly. "It's just us now," she whispered to her unborn child. "But we'll be all right. I promise." What she couldn't possibly know was that 7 years later, she would return to upend the carefully constructed lies that had destroyed her life, or that the path to redemption would begin in the most unlikely of places, the cleaning staff break room at Oxford University. "Push, Eleanor! One more time!" The midwife's encouragement barely penetrated the fog of exhaustion surrounding Eleanor as she labored in the maternity ward of John Radcliffe Hospital. 20 hours after her waters had broken in the tiny bedsit she now called home, Eleanor gave one final monumental push. The cry that filled the room seconds later was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "It's a boy," the midwife announced triumphantly. But before Eleanor could fully process this miracle, another contraction gripped her. The second midwife's eyes widened. "There's another one coming!" 12 minutes later, Eleanor Bennett became mother to not one, but two perfect baby boys. Oliver and Henry, identical in every way, except for the tiny birthmark on Henry's left shoulder, lay swaddled against her chest in the ward of the hospital where, ironically, Richard had once sat on the board of directors. "Twins," she whispered, incredulously, studying their tiny features that so unmistakably resembled their father. "No wonder I was so enormous." Sister Margaret from the women's shelter, where Eleanor had found refuge, sat beside the bed, her kind eyes crinkling with delight. "They're beautiful, Eleanor. Perfect little miracles." The past 5 months had been a blur of survival. After being thrown out of her home, Eleanor had spent 3 desperate nights in a budget hotel before her dwindling funds forced her to seek help at St. Catherine's Women's Shelter. There, she had found not only a roof over her head, but a community of women who understood what it meant to rebuild from nothing. "Your CV arrived at the university," Sister Margaret said, gently stroking Henry's tiny hand. "The cleaning supervisor was quite impressed with your organizational skills." Eleanor nodded gratefully. The position as part of Oxford University's cleaning staff was hardly what she had envisioned for herself, the wife of one of Britain's most successful pharmaceutical entrepreneurs, but it came with modest staff accommodation that would house her and the twins. "It starts in 6 weeks," Eleanor replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Just enough time to recover and get settled." What Eleanor didn't share was the letter she had received that morning from Richard's solicitors, detailing the terms of their separation. He was offering a settlement that would provide comfortable living for her and the child, singular, in exchange for her signature on divorce papers and a non-disclosure agreement about their marriage. He didn't know about the twins. He didn't believe the baby was his. And Eleanor, her pride still raw and bleeding, had decided he didn't deserve to know. 6 weeks later, Eleanor pushed a double pram through the ancient corridors of Oxford University's science department in the pre-dawn hours. The twins slept peacefully as she emptied bins, wiped surfaces, and vacuumed carpets, her body still aching from childbirth, but her spirit refusing to bend. It was in this unlikely setting, as she polished the wooden desk in Office 307, that Eleanor first met Professor Benjamin Thornton. The distinguished biochemistry professor had arrived unexpectedly early, startling her as she dusted his bookshelves. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," he apologized, noticing how she had jumped at his entrance. His gaze moved to the sleeping infants in the pram. "You've brought company, I see." Eleanor blushed deeply. "I'm so sorry, Professor." The childminder doesn't start until 8, and my shift begins at 6. I promise they won't disturb your work." Instead of the reprimand she expected, Professor Thornton's face softened. "What are their names?" "Oliver and Henry," Eleanor replied, surprised by his interest. "Splendid names. Strong." He smiled kindly, then noticed the copy of Advanced Pharmacology she had propped open on his waste bin while cleaning. "Light reading." Eleanor hastily closed the book. "Just curious. I'll finish up quickly and get out of your way." Professor Thornton studied her for a moment. "You know, the university has a program for staff who wish to pursue further education. Discounted courses, flexible scheduling." He handed her a business card. "If you're interested, come to my office hours. That mind of yours seems wasted on polishing my desk." As Eleanor wheeled the pram out of his office, something warm and forgotten flickered to life inside her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. Possibility. That night, as the twins slept in their shared cot, Eleanor took out a notebook and began to write. Ideas that had been forming during her marriage to Richard, concepts about ethical pharmaceutical development that she had shared with him but that he had dismissed as impractical. Now, with nothing left to lose, these ideas became her silent companions as she plotted a future that seemed impossible but necessary for her sons and for herself. "Mummy, look! I've drawn our new company logo." 6-year-old Oliver proudly held up a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a green leaf with Vita Nova scrawled beneath it in childish handwriting. Eleanor smiled, ruffling her son's hair as she juggled her graduation cap in one hand and her thesis in the other. "It's perfect, darling. Perhaps we'll use it someday." Henry tugged at her graduation gown, his face a mirror image of his brother's, except for the serious expression he habitually wore. "Are we really going to make medicine like Daddy's company?" Eleanor knelt to meet her son's eyes. "Better medicine, sweetheart. Medicine that helps people without making them pay too much." Professor Thornton approached, beaming with pride. "Eleanor Bennett, first-class honors in biochemistry and pharmaceutical sciences. Not bad for a woman who started by cleaning my office." The journey from cleaner to graduate had been arduous but transformative. For 4 years, Eleanor had attended lectures during her son's school hours, studied late into the night after they were asleep, and worked weekends to make ends meet. Professor Thornton had become not just her academic advisor, but her champion, recognizing in Eleanor a brilliant mind and indomitable spirit. "I couldn't have done it without you, Professor," Eleanor said sincerely. "Benjamin, please. We're colleagues now," he corrected with a smile. "And I've some news that might interest you. That research proposal you submitted last term? Wellcome Trust wants to fund it." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "The ethical pricing model for essential medications? They're interested." Not just interested, enthusiastic. "They're offering a substantial grant to launch a proof of concept." Benjamin handed her an envelope. "Congratulations, Dr. Bennett. It seems Vita Nova Pharmaceuticals might become more than just a drawing." 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the modest laboratory space she had secured in a business incubator on the outskirts of Oxford. Around her, a small team of scientists, former classmates who shared her vision, worked diligently on reformulating an existing asthma medication to be produced at a fraction of the cost. The clinical trials show efficacy equivalent to Harrington Pharmaceuticals' Respirex, her research associate confirmed, sliding a report across the table. "But our production method reduces costs by nearly 70%. Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. Respirex had been Richard's most profitable drug, one that millions of asthma sufferers depended upon, but that was priced so highly many couldn't afford it. Now, Vita Nova was about to change that paradigm. Package the data for the regulatory submission, Eleanor instructed, and schedule the press conference for next month. It's time to introduce Vita Nova to the world. What Eleanor didn't know was that across town, in the gleaming headquarters of Harrington Pharmaceuticals, Julian Whitfield was placing a copy of Vita Nova's press release on Richard Harrington's desk. Some upstart company is planning to undercut Respirex, Julian explained casually. Founded by a former Oxford student. Nothing to worry about yet, but I thought you should know. Richard barely glanced at the paper. At 49, he had aged noticeably. The pressure of running his company while maintaining the facade of his perfect life with Sophie taking its toll. Their engagement had stretched into a 7-year arrangement with no wedding date in sight. Handle it, Julian. That's what I pay you for, Richard dismissed, turning back to the quarterly reports. And remind Sophie we're expected at the Pharmaceutical Association Gala next month. She's been avoiding these functions lately. Julian nodded, concealing his concern. He had recognized Eleanor's name immediately on the press release, despite her use of her maiden name professionally. If Richard discovered who was behind Vita Nova, the carefully constructed world Julian had built might crumble. Later that evening, as the twins completed their homework at the kitchen table of their modest but comfortable home, Eleanor received an unexpected call. "Dr. Bennett, this is Dr. Agarwal from the Royal Society. We've reviewed your ethical pricing model and would like to invite you to present at next month's Pharmaceutical Innovation Gala." Eleanor's heart raced. The gala was the industry's most prestigious event, and Richard would certainly be there. "I'd be honored," she replied, her voice steady despite the thundering in her chest. "By any chance, will Harrington Pharmaceuticals be represented?" "Oh, yes. Richard Harrington never misses it. He's receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award this year," Dr. Agarwal confirmed. "Is that a problem?" Eleanor watched her sons, Richard's sons, as they bent over their schoolbooks, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. "Not at all," she replied. "In fact, it's perfect timing." 7 years after being cast out pregnant and alone, Eleanor Bennett was about to step back into Richard Harrington's world, not as his disgraced wife, but as his industry rival. And she was bringing 2 unexpected guests with her. The Royal Society's Pharmaceutical Innovation Gala transformed the historic Burlington House into a glittering showcase of Britain's medical elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathering of scientists, executives, and investors, who represented the industry's power brokers. Eleanor smoothed the simple but elegant midnight blue gown she had carefully selected for the evening. Beside her, Oliver and Henry fidgeted in their matching suits, unaccustomed to such formal attire. "Remember what we discussed, boys," Eleanor reminded them gently. "This is an important night for Mummy's work. You'll meet many new people, but No, Mum," Henry interrupted, with the solemn maturity that often made him seem older than his 7 years. "We're not to mention that we've never met our father." Oliver nodded enthusiastically. "Even though he'll be here tonight." Eleanor felt a momentary pang of guilt. She had finally told the twins about their father, explaining that he hadn't known about them because of a misunderstanding. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now. "That's right. And remember, your surname tonight is Bennett. Like mine." As they entered the grand hall, Eleanor felt dozens of curious glances. While Vita Nova had generated significant buzz in pharmaceutical circles, few had met its enigmatic founder. Even fewer knew of her connection to Richard Harrington. "Dr. Bennett, what an honor to finally meet you." Dr. Agarwal approached, shaking. Eleanor's hand warmly before bending to greet the twins. "And who might these handsome young gentlemen be?" "My sons, Oliver and Henry." Eleanor introduced them proudly. "They're my inspiration for everything Vita Nova stands for." Across the room, Sophie Blackwood froze mid-conversation, her champagne flute halting halfway to her lips as she spotted Eleanor. 7 years had transformed the broken, pregnant woman she had helped destroy into a poised, confident professional. But it was the 2 small boys at Eleanor's side that sent a chill down Sophie's spine. "Julian!" she hissed urgently, gripping her fiancé's arm. "She's here! Eleanor! And she has children. Twins. They look exactly like Richard." Julian Whitfield's carefully maintained composure slipped for just a moment. "Impossible. She's not on the guest list. I checked specifically. She's listed as Dr. Eleanor Bennett, founder of Vita Nova," Sophie whispered frantically. "The company that's threatening our Respirex patent. It's her, Julian. What do we do?" Before Julian could respond, the room's attention was drawn to the entrance of Richard Harrington. At 49, Richard remained an imposing figure, though the years had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations for his upcoming award. Eleanor felt her heart race as she watched him. Despite everything, seeing him again after 7 years stirred complicated emotions. She steeled herself, reaching down to hold her son's hands. "Is that him, Mum?" Oliver whispered, his eyes wide as he studied Richard from across the room. "He looks like us." "Yes, darling. That's him." The night progressed with excruciating slowness as Eleanor navigated the crowd, introducing herself and her company's mission to influential stakeholders. She delivered her presentation on Vita Nova's ethical pricing model to enthusiastic applause, all while aware of Richard's growing confusion as he repeatedly glanced in her direction. It was during Richard's acceptance speech that the inevitable confrontation began to unfold. "And so I dedicate this award to the future of pharmaceutical innovation," Richard concluded, raising his glass, "to making life-saving medications accessible to all who need them." Eleanor couldn't help but laugh softly, the irony too sharp to ignore. The sound, though quiet, carried in the momentary silence after his speech. Richard's eyes locked with hers for the first time, recognition dawning on his face. "Eleanor," he whispered, the microphone unfortunately still active, broadcasting his shock to the entire room. The crowd murmured in confusion as Richard stepped down from the podium and moved directly toward Eleanor, his expression a complex mix of disbelief and anger. Julian attempted to intercept him, but Richard brushed past without acknowledgement. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded in a low voice when he reached her. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I was invited. My company's ethical pricing model is being recognized tonight." "Your company?" Richard's brow furrowed. "You're behind Vita Nova?" Before Eleanor could respond, Oliver and Henry emerged from behind her, where they had been partially concealed by her gown. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Richard stared at the 2 boys who could have been miniature versions of himself. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Oliver and Henry," Eleanor said quietly. "Your sons." Richard paled visibly, his hand reaching for the nearest table to steady himself. "That's not possible. The pregnancy, it wasn't mine." "You said—" "I never said anything of the sort," Eleanor corrected firmly. "You assumed. And I was carrying twins, not a single child." The intensity of the moment was broken by a commotion near the entrance. Henry, who had wandered a few steps away during the confrontation, suddenly collapsed onto the marble floor. "Henry!" Eleanor cried, rushing to her son's side. "Someone call an ambulance!" As the gala dissolved into chaos around them, Richard found himself kneeling beside the small boy who wore his face, watching in helpless shock as Eleanor cradled their unconscious son. "He has a rare form of anemia," Eleanor explained tersely as paramedics arrived. "It flares up under stress." Richard's world, so carefully reconstructed after Eleanor's departure, was shattering around him for the second time. But this time, the devastation came not from what he had lost, but from what he had never known he had. The antiseptic smell of John Radcliffe Hospital's pediatric ward brought a wave of déjà vu to Eleanor as she sat beside Henry's bed, her fingers intertwined with his small hand. 7 years earlier, she had given birth to her sons in this very hospital, alone and terrified about the future. Now, as machines monitored Henry's condition, she was no longer alone. But the fear remained. "His hemoglobin levels are dangerously low," Dr. Patel explained, studying the chart. "We need to prepare for a transfusion." Oliver sat quietly on a chair in the corner, his usual exuberance subdued by worry for his twin. "Will Henry be all right, Mummy?" Before Eleanor could answer, the door opened and Richard entered hesitantly. He had followed the ambulance to the hospital, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly unwilling to leave. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Eleanor nodded, watching as Richard approached Henry's bedside. For a moment, he simply stared at the boy, taking in every detail of the child he hadn't known existed until hours ago. "He looks just like my father," Richard murmured, emotion thickening his voice. Dr. Patel cleared her throat. "Mrs. Bennet." "Dr. Bennet," Eleanor corrected automatically. "Dr. Bennet," the physician amended. "We're having difficulty finding a suitable blood match for Henry. His condition is complicated by a rare antigen profile." Richard straightened immediately. "Test me. I'm his father." The next hours passed in a blur of medical tests, hushed conversations, and mounting tension. Richard's blood proved to be a perfect match, the missing piece that could save Henry's life. As the transfusion began, Eleanor found herself in the hospital corridor with Richard, both needing a moment away from the intensity of the room. "Why? Didn't you tell me?" Richard asked quietly, the question he had been holding back since the gala. Eleanor leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "You accused me of infidelity, Richard. You threw me out without giving me a chance to explain. When I discovered I was carrying twins, I was living in a women's shelter, trying to figure out how to survive." Richard flinched at her words. "I received those messages." "Messages I never sent," Eleanor interrupted. "Have you ever considered they might have been fabricated? That perhaps someone had a vested interest in destroying our marriage?" A flicker of doubt crossed Richard's face. "Who would do such a thing?" Eleanor gave him a pointed look. "Who benefited most from my absence? Who stepped into my place in your life and your company?" Richard's expression darkened as the implications of her words sank in. The carefully constructed narrative he had accepted for 7 years began to crumble around him. Back in Henry's room, Oliver had fallen asleep in the chair beside his brother's bed. Richard watched the twins with a mixture of wonder and regret. "I've missed everything," he said softly. "Their first words, first steps." "Yes, you have," Eleanor acknowledged without malice. "But they're only 7. There's still time, if that's what you want." Richard met her gaze directly. "What about you, Eleanor? After everything, could you ever forgive me?" Before she could respond, her mobile phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. The headline made her gasp, Harrington Pharmaceuticals under investigation. Internal documents reveal deliberate price gouging and data manipulation. Richard's phone chimed seconds later, followed by a flurry of calls he declined. "Julian," he muttered, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. It was always Julian, wasn't it? And Sophie? The following days brought revelations that shook the pharmaceutical world. Anonymous whistleblowers had released documents showing Julian Whitfield had systematically manipulated research data and artificially inflated drug prices while Richard was distracted by his personal life. More damning still were the recovered text messages proving Julian and Sophie had orchestrated Eleanor's dismissal to gain control over Richard and the company. As Henry recovered in hospital, Richard spent hours by his bedside, reading stories and getting to know both his sons. Oliver, initially wary, gradually warmed to his father's presence, especially when Richard revealed a shared passion for cricket. "I'd like them to have my surname," Richard said one afternoon, as he and Eleanor shared a cup of terrible hospital cafeteria tea. "Not to erase what you've built. They should keep Bennett, too. But they're Harringtons as well." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. That would be their decision to make. They're old enough to have a say. 2 weeks after Henry's hospitalization, Eleanor received an unexpected offer, a prestigious position to expand Vita Nova internationally, based in Switzerland. It would mean relocating just as the twins were forming a relationship with their father. "Take it," Richard urged when she shared the news. "It's an incredible opportunity. The boys can visit me during school holidays." Eleanor shook her head. "They need stability, Richard. They need both parents, even if we're not together. I'm declining the offer." Richard's expression shifted to one of profound respect. "After everything I did and failed to do, you're putting the boys first. Giving up an opportunity like this? It's not a sacrifice when it's for the right reasons," Eleanor replied simply. As Harrington Pharmaceuticals underwent restructuring following Julian's arrest and Sophie's disgrace, Richard approached Eleanor with an unexpected proposal. "Merge our companies," he suggested. "Vita Nova's ethical approach with Harrington's resources and reach. We could transform the industry." Eleanor considered the idea carefully. "As equal partners?" "Completely equal," Richard confirmed. "In fact, I think you should lead the research division. It was always your strongest suit." The merger of Vita Nova and Harrington Pharmaceuticals created ripples throughout the medical world. Under their joint leadership, life-saving medications became affordable to millions who had previously gone without. The Bennett Harrington Foundation, funded by their profits, supported healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. Richard never returned to the Georgian townhouse where he had once cast Eleanor out. Instead, he purchased a home near Eleanor's, allowing the twins to move easily between both parents. It wasn't the family they had once envisioned, but it was something new and, in many ways, stronger for having been broken and carefully reassembled. Hauni Tiuanver, the twins' 8th birthday, as they blew out candles on a cake surrounded by their extended family, Eleanor caught Richard's eye across the table. The journey from betrayal to redemption had been arduous, but as she watched her sons' faces illuminated by candlelight, she knew every step had been necessary. "Worth it?" Richard asked quietly, somehow understanding her thoughts. Eleanor nodded, finally at peace with the past and open to the future. "Every moment,"